He glanced at the rat, then put out a finger and lifted one of the small, neat paws. Nearly 12 hours. Limp. The rigour had already passed. It was warm up here at the top of the house. Then he turned to the counter that ran along the far wall of the laboratory, where a line of rats lay, possibly insensible, probably dead. He walked slowly along the line, prodding each body. Limp, limp, stiff. Stiff, stiff. All dead without doubt. Each had had a smaller dose than the last, but all had died, though he couldn't yet be positive about the latest. Wait a bit more, then, to be sure. He needed to know, because the Court of Miracles was talking, and they said the frog was back. The English Channel. They did say that red hair was a sign of the devil. Joan eyed her escort's fiery locks consideringly. The wind on deck was fierce enough to make her eyes water, and it jerked bits of Michael Murray's hair out of its binding, so they did dance round his head like flames a bit. You might expect his face to be as ugly as sin if he was one of the devils, though, and it wasn't. Lucky for him, he looked like his mother in the face, she thought critically. His younger brother Ian wasn't so fortunate, and that without the heathen tattoos. Michael's was a fairly pleasant face, for all it was blotched with windburn and the lingering marks of sorrow. And no wonder, him having just lost his father, and his wife dead in France no more than a month before that. But she wasn't braving this gale in order to watch Michael Murray, even if he might burst into tears or turn into old Horny on the spot. She touched her crucifix for reassurance, just in case. It had been blessed by the priest, and her mother had carried it all the way to St. Ninian's Spring and dipped it in the water there to ask the saint's protection. And it was her mother she wanted to see, as long as ever she could. She pulled her kerchief off and waved it, keeping a tight grip lest the wind make off with it. Her mother was growing smaller on the quay, waving madly too, Joey behind her, with his arm round her waist to keep her from falling into the water. Joan snorted a bit at sight of her new stepfather, but then thought better and touched the crucifix again, muttering a quick act of contrition in penance. After all, it was she herself who'd made that marriage happen, and a good thing too. If not, she'd still be stuck to home at Balrigan, not on her way at last to be a bride of Christ in France. A nudge at her elbow made her glance aside to see Michael offering her a handkerchief. Well, so, if her eyes were streaming, aye, and her nose. It was no wonder, the wind so fierce as it was. She took the scrap of cloth with a curt nod of thanks, scrubbed briefly at her cheeks, and waved her kerchief harder. None of his family had come to see Michael off, not even his twin sister Janet. But they were taken up with all there was to do in the wake of old Ian Murray's death, and no wonder. No need to see Michael to the ship either. Michael Murray was a wine merchant in Paris, and a wonderfully well-travelled gentleman. She took some comfort from the knowledge that he knew what to do and where to go, and had said he would see her safely delivered to the Convent of Angels, because the thought of making her way through Paris alone, and the streets full of people all speaking French, though she knew French quite well, of course, she'd been studying it all the winter, and Michael's mother helping her, though perhaps she had better not tell the Reverend Mother about the sorts of French novels Jenny Murray had in her bookshelf, because— Voulez-vous descendre, mademoiselle? Eh? She glanced at him to see him gesturing toward the hatchway that led downstairs. She turned back, blinking, but the key had vanished, and her mother with it. No, she said, not yet. I'll just— She wanted to see the land so long as she could. It would be her last sight of Scotland ever, and the thought made her wame curl into a small, tight ball. She waved a vague hand toward the hatchway. You go, though. I'm all right by myself. He didn't go, but came to stand beside her, gripping the rail.